Hi folks, Rob Goller here. Thanks for joining me again for our weekly chat about local history. As always, appreciate your support of this project. Again, the numbers are going up each and every week, so I appreciate that and other people's interest in local history or history in general. Today is election day if you're watching live. If not, you will be after the election. A lot of you watch after not live in the days following. So I have no idea how the election is going to work out. So even if you're watching after more information is known, I do not at this moment going live right now know it's 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. I don't know how the election will end up. So I'm not going to specifically talk about the election, even though a few folks have been asking me. Someone had asked me about the history of elections in East Aurora and how East Aurora votes, and I said, well, I just happen to have talked about that in recent weeks, so you can look up. There's a great search function on Facebook and YouTube on the channel. You can look up any topic. So if you want to look up presidential elections and see what we chatted about in a previous week, um, someone had asked me about daylight saving time, and I just happened to have talked about that previously too. That was one of the first topics I talked about, I think 2 years ago. We've been doing this for more than 2 years. So just put daylight saving time in the search function, and you'll find what we talked about 2 years ago. I may update those in the coming months, or actually with daylight saving time, it'll be when we change over again. It'd be a good topic to update. Um, Little teaser, little spoiler alert. I am in favor of daylight saving time from a historical perspective. I know some people are looking to either get rid of it or have daylight saving time all year, but check out the video to see if you agree with me. And then finally, this is probably one of the warmest. I don't know if they said this morning that it's the warmest, hottest actually. I wouldn't call it warm today. Uh, Election days on record here in our Buffalo area in East Aurora. And that got me to thinking, because I remember 2 years ago, and actually they were pointing to hot days on the news this morning, and they had said that um, in on November 5th of 2022, it was 79 degrees. So we're expected to get to 77 today. So just 2 years ago, we were at 79, and it triggered a memory in my brain. And one of the things we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, and I've heard this more and more too, is our memories are terrible when it comes to remembering history. Um, and just on Facebook recently, someone had posted they swore that something happened before 1980, when in fact it happened in the early 2000s. That's how off they were. And we all do this. We all kind of lose track of time especially as we get older. So I went back to check, and I was like, I remember saying 2 years ago to somebody when we had that warm early November, I said, be careful, because we're relishing this weather today, but that leaves the Lake Erie, wide open, warm, and the first Arctic cold that comes from Canada, that front that comes down we're going to get a lot of snow. We're going to pay for this weather. When that's the old saying, we're going to pay for it. This nice weather, and I remember saying that in early November. I'm not a meteorologist. I have no idea. But what happened about 2 weeks later? We got 8, 9 feet of snow, and that was our second Snowvember. So I went back. I was thinking, well, is this a pattern? Is this something that happens where we get a warm snap either late October or early November, summer in October, November, and does that lead to big November storms? So I went back to 2014, which was the other Snowvember storm that all of us remember. Um, and similarly, there was a 67-degree day on November 11th that year. And I do remember that well. It was my birthday, and I remember it being a really warm day. And then a couple weeks later, we got the Snowvember of 2014, that 1-2 punch of snow. Um, and I thought, well, is there a pattern here? 67 is certainly not 79 or 77, and it was one day. So I went back even further to 1900, because I've written about November storms, and we've talked about November storms before. Um, and we had a big November storm in the middle of November in 1900. And I looked back in the weather statistics. It's easy to do. and I saw that it was 71 on October 25th and 67 on Halloween. Not as warm as the Halloweens we had this year. So a similar pattern. And then we got walloped a couple weeks later with feet of snow, a November storm in 1900. However, before we go so I thought, as I was reading that, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm vindicated. I know what I'm talking about. Perhaps there's a pattern here. Well, then I looked at a few other years, and we've had warm late Octobers, warm, hot days, late October, early November, um, and no November storm resulted from it. Uh, Perfect example is the next year, 1900, the next year, 1901. It was 69 on Halloween, and we don't have a November storm that followed that of feet of snow. So before we get into today's topic, I thought I'd chat about that because we've been talking about the weather all day, and I kept saying out loud to my friends, oh, we're going to pay for this because history tells us that we're going to pay for it. Well, history doesn't necessarily tell us that. Yes, we've had warm spells in the weeks preceding the November storms, but having those warm spells does not seem to relate to mean that we're going to get a big November snowfall the week before Thanksgiving, which tends to be when these things happen. So we will see what happens. I'll be interested to look back on this video later in November. But I don't think I'm again not a meteorologist. This is totally a layman's look at just the statistics, and I thought it would be fun to do that. So although I thought I had a correlation, I don't think I do. So we've had warm days in late October, November that didn't mean that we were going to pay for it later. So we'll see what happens this year. So the topic this week I wanted to talk about, and I've gotten a lot of feedback on it, and I really appreciate it, is this article that I've been working on for quite a long time. I wanted to work on it. It sort of sat on the back burner because it wasn't timely. And then it kind of became timely. And it was what spurred it is that I saw a front page headline as I was looking for something else as I was researching in the East Aurora Advertiser in early summer of 1918 that said German barred, and the school board was banning the teaching of the German language in the schools, which would today be the middle school level and the high school level, um, because of World War One, because of the anti-German sentiment of during World War One. And at first I thought, wow, I've heard of this. We knew this was happening. I had heard of anti-German sentiment both during World War One and during World War Two. Also in the late 1800s, and early 1900s, anti-immigrant across the board, anti-immigrant sentiment. But I never saw it documented in such a powerful way, such a succinct way. Actually, it was only a couple paragraphs on the front page of the Easter Advertiser, and I was amazed that it was happening here in East Aurora. We often fall into the trap of thinking these things when we read about them in history textbooks or in history books that they happen somewhere else, and did not happen here. And I just posted a link to the article, and I'll do that on YouTube when I post there as well, is a link to the article that I'm talking about if you want to go and read that. But I saw this and I had to do a little more digging. And the school board in East Aurora um, was part of this nationwide, and actually more than that, it went into the European countries as well, um, anti-German sentiment during World War One. And what ended up happening is that because Germany was our enemy during adversary during World War One, there was an anti-German sentiment across the country, and when I say anti-German, I don't mean just German citizens who happened to be living here, what they called alien citizens or aliens at the time. It also included German American citizens, American citizens of German descent. Anyone with an accent, a German accent, was targeted, and this had started during the late 1800s. But once we declared war, the United States declared war on Germany, it was like a light switch went off. There were they called them super democracy, super patriotic groups that were out there trying to get German banned, German culture, and the German language in particular. And one of the places they targeted was schools. And you can read all about it, but I was again, I always think we run into this trap that East Aurora is in this bubble and that we don't do this sort of thing. Well, I'm quickly learning as I'm studying various historical periods, and I know that we've had discrimination in East Aurora, of course, but to have it reported in the newspaper in such a way, to have it documented, really kind of hit home for me that yes, this did happen and we have it documented. So the school board voted in June of 1918. And they followed a bunch of other school districts across the state and across the country. States banned the teaching of German in schools. Um, New York did not, so each school district made their own decision. The New York Times, as I was doing some research, had lots of articles about schools voting to ban German. And according to the East Aurora Advertiser, the vote was unanimous to ban German. Uh, and the credits that were given for previous German classes were still allowed to stay. Some school districts did not. They took the credits away. That's how bad this discrimination went. That's how far this discrimination went. That if even if you took German, you might end up not getting credit for those classes. East Aurora kept those credits, but the following school year, 1919 to 1920, no more German. The students had to find a new language. And we had taught French and Latin at the time in the schools. As I pointed out in the newspaper article, we had been teaching German for a very long time, dating back to the Aurora Academy, which was the private school that predated the public school. And they in the 1860s, I think it was, that they added German to the curriculum, and it made sense because we had a lot of German immigrants here in East Aurora, a lot. And there's a lot of communities across our region that had influx of German immigrants, my great grandparents included. My fourth great grandparents on one side, and then my great great grandparents on the other. But my great great grandparents on one side of the family came during just before World War One, the United States involvement in World War One. So uh, there was an influx of these German immigrants. They started German organizations. There was a German band, German singing society, a German band at the Roycroft campus. Emmanuel Lutheran Church was founded by German immigrants. It was called the German Lutheran Church. They had services in German. Germans helped build this community. And so I found that very interesting that a community with so many German Americans doing so many important things civically in our community that would have the school board saying their language and culture is part of the enemy. What was happening is the German culture, the German language was not being differentiated from the German government at the time. The adversary was the German government, not the German culture. And what I found even more fascinating and more interesting was that just a year earlier, before the school board voted here in East Aurora to ban the teaching of German, is in the newspaper. There was this article. Uh, the East Aurora Advertiser reprinted an editorial from another newspaper, which was common at the time, praising Germany, praising their educational system, praising their employment rate, praising all sorts of things about about Germans and German culture, German products that were imported. So it blew my mind that within a year, um, the sentiment had switched to anti-German simply because we were at war with the government of the day. So I'm trying to picture our community, and this was happening in East Aurora. And one of the things that kind of surprised me is it didn't seem like this extended to the churches. The German Lutheran churches continued to offer services in German throughout the war. They actually advertised it in the Advertiser, and they had German festivals. So that sort of thing didn't seem to be impacted. So outside the school. but the language of the school board, which seemed boilerplate to me, like somebody had just given them the resolution, was basically saying that we don't need this German culture. It's evil. We don't need the language. We could be spending our time on better things, teaching our kids better things. When in fact a year earlier they were the community was being told that the German culture was wonderful and actually had more advanced than us. And there had been anti-German propaganda in the newspaper for after war was declared. So leading up to this vote of the school board, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment. But it struck me that how quickly the sentiment had changed. Yes, there had been anti-German sentiment in the 1800s, along with other immigrant groups, Irish, and then later even Polish immigrants. But it kind of struck me how quickly it changed. Uh, so German was the language in the school was only one facet. In some communities, and I didn't see it happen here, there were places where they tried to ban big cities tried to ban the speaking of German in public or at a public assembly. So you could be at a church service. They were trying to ban German at church services. Police commissioners were calling it the language of the enemy, and that there was a fear that the German people, German American citizens, were actually um, uh, sympathetic to Germany, and that they were plotting for Germany, plotting for the enemy during these secret meetings in German. And they didn't have anybody translating, so they didn't really know if they were plotting. Well, it turns out they weren't. The Emmanuelson Church here in East Aurora, there's no indication that any of these groups that were meeting here in East Aurora were doing that. But what was funny is interesting was that none of these rules, none of these laws, anti-German, banning German newspapers, some cities banned those, is they didn't seem to come from the legislative branch. In many cases, a police commissioner would just deem German illegal. And that was interesting because there's a little problem with banning the speaking of a language in public or in a church service or something like that. We have the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and it most certainly would not have passed the First Amendment muster, if you will, at the time. Now, so what would happen is a police commissioner or someone like that would deem, for emergency purposes, we're in an emergency, we're in war, would deem the German language illegal, even though they didn't have the power to do that. And so they would use their emergency powers sometimes to do that. And I read all about that. You can read all about that if you search through national newspapers, that was happening in other communities. In some cases, it wasn't the government dictating, banning German. In some schools and some colleges, the colleges would continue to offer German. Because of the anti-German sentiment, however, students wouldn't sign up for the class. And so that was happening in a lot of places. And then there were individual, like, I think it was a part of New York City, one of the boroughs, it was one of the newspaper dealers associations. So a private association that was banning the sale of German magazines and newspapers. So not the government, but there would be the anti-German sentiment would impact the community because of a private organization or a nonprofit organization that would ban German. So it wasn't the government doing it. After the war, German was these sorts of rules and were deemed unconstitutional. Today we look back and we're like, of course. But during the time while it's happening, people were saying that German should not be spoken in public. There were a lot of there are great German fairy tales, stories, novels that students were reading from. German is basis of a lot of other languages, of course. You don't need me to tell you all this, the benefit of German, and those were all banned as well. What was very interesting to me, though, is, and I thought this first, and then I found someone else saying the same thing, is that during World War I, did it make sense for us to be banning the study of the language of the adversary? Wouldn't we want people who would know how to speak the language of the enemy? And by banning the language, people learning the language, we would not be able to translate. So, from a purely tactical standpoint, to me, it didn't make any sense that we wouldn't want to be learning the language. And then I find a newspaper article that had indicated that the commissioner of education had said that these bans made no sense, and he was echoing kind of what I was thinking. So I was like, thank goodness somebody was saying it at the time, but in many cases it didn't do any good. Um, German was not taught in East Aurora schools for another decade. And I was able to find it by going through all the newspapers. I went through the curriculum and the list of teachers each year. And we have a great collection at the historian's office of school catalogs. So I was able to look through the school catalogs. And I think I said in the article it was 1929 that it just returned. And that was when they hired a new dean of girls. And she just happened to also teach German. And so German just got slipped back in the curriculum. There was no banner headline on the Easter Advertiser that said German returns, but they did. It was a decade without German, and in many cases, you'll see that the German language trickled away, and a lot of people, a lot of organizations, the Lutheran churches, assimilated into English over time. Here in East Aurora, though, I see that it lasted, I would think, a little bit longer than in other places, which I found interesting. Um, so this teacher taught German, and I took a peek into World War II, thinking that the anti-German sentiment there might have led to a ban on German again. It did not. The anti-German sentiment certainly was there, but not to the extent that it was in World War I. And she kept teaching German through the Second World War, and they kept teaching German for. It was one of the world languages, the one of the 3 or 4 basic world languages that were offered in the school during World War II and beyond. So it didn't have the same impact during World War II. The reason this is so important to us today in studying history, I think, is that if throughout the article, as I was, as hopefully as you're reading it, and as I was researching it, and as I'm talking to you today about it, um, I I was struck by how some of the sentiment and the language that was used in the school board's official resolution banning German, and some of the other things that I read, that how it's echoing some of the things we're hearing from our some of our candidates for office today, and people in office today, and how they're not, a lot of times we don't differentiate between American citizens and people who are not citizens from another country, but regardless, putting a blame on a group of people and their culture, um, even though it's not warranted. And in many cases, it doesn't even make sense, but it's a good way to blame a group of people. And how so throughout history we've been blaming groups of people, and it's changed. I'm doing a little more research into the anti-Polish American movement. There was actually movements against our American citizens of Polish ancestry, um, and like I said before, Italians, Irish, especially in the late 1800s, and some of it's documented in the newspapers, surprisingly, and some of it's not, and that's a hard thing, harder thing to research when it's not documented. Redlining absolutely has happened in small towns, and of course it's not always documented. So I'm working more on that. But I was very struck by the language just in this anti-German sentiment of World War One, how we're hearing the same thing today. So I invite you to read the article and let me know what you think. Um, just using a different group of people in a different country and a different backgrounds of people, of their ethnic origins, or where their ancestors came from. It's the same arguments, same discriminatory arguments, in many cases racist arguments, against people, but you just change the place that their ancestors came from. That's all that was happening, and so some people will say to me, "Why do we bring this up? We should just, that happened in the past." Well, what sometimes we study history to point out that we have not learned our lesson, and I think that's the case in some cases here. That we should know better today. We look back in the over 100 years ago, and we're looking, oh, they did it back then too, and I said, but we should know better today, and how far we sometimes haven't come when it comes to these sorts of topics, and so that's why I think this makes it really important. And the other thing that we're hearing it in the rhetoric of our campaigns for elected office still today. And the other thing is to not forget that sometimes when we read textbooks about national history, about American history, when we hear about anti-German sentiment during World War I, when we hear about anti-black sentiment, discriminatory racism, when we read about it in our textbooks, we forget that it happened here. The Ku Klux Klan was active in Western New York in the 1920s. It's documented. So one of the lessons we can learn out of these studying this part of our history and talking about it is acknowledging the fact that this wasn't happening just south of the Mason-Dixon line. That these things weren't just happening in the big cities; they were happening in our small towns, East Aurora and otherwise. Of course, East Aurora wasn't the only one that dealt with this issue. So remembering that yes, it did happen here, and it happened in our communities. It happened right here in our communities. We weren't exempt from this discriminatory behavior, and in some cases, like today, we are kind of surprised when something is officially discussed, not just talked about at a coffee shop or discrimination, under the radar. That it's actually documented. A school board came out with anti-German sentiment 100 years ago. The school board, and that how official it was. It wasn't just something that was talked about, under the radar. It was actually officially declared by the school board. So I found that very enlightening. So the reason I wanted to talk about it today is, in addition to the fact that it was the recent newspaper article that I had, the most recent newspaper column that I had in the Advertiser, was that in the past couple of weeks we've been hearing rhetoric that's eerily similar, and so the timing really is kind of strange for me that I've been working on this this topic for a couple years now, researching, since I noticed that front page headline in the East Aurora Advertiser that said that they had banned German in the East Aurora School District. So again, it's election day. If you're watching live or a little bit after, be sure to vote. And next week we'll talk a little bit more about elections. I talked previously about presidential election results and how East Aurora and the town of Aurora voted, and I talked about it. If the results, they get very detailed results. The Board of Elections, the New York Times has a great map. So next week I think I'll talk a little bit about an update to how we vote in a presidential election, because we'll have the data from today, from this week, and I'm hoping to be able to look at some trends when it comes to how we vote in the presidential election. Thanks for joining me. Enjoy this warm weather. And again, I'm Rob Goller. I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not officially connected to my position as Town and Village Historian. Again, if you have any comments or questions, especially about this topic, I'd be happy to hear. I'd be eager to hear what you think about it. Pop them in the comments or send me a private message, as a lot of you do. And we'll see you next time. And as always, thank you for keeping history alive. Take care.